Hi, welcome to my review of the Winternight Trilogy by Katherine Arden. I will be doing separate reviews of the individual books sometime in the future, but for now it is a series overview and my overall thoughts on the series. Now, I'll preface this review by saying that this is one of my favorite young adult series of all time. It is only beaten by the likes of Harry Potter, the Six of Crows duology, and the Bartimaeus trilogy. And I would say this is my fourth favorite YA series. So let me start off with what I really enjoy. Number one, Katherine Arden has one of the most exquisite prose I have read. When you watch a Miyazaki film, you feel very immersed within the Japanese culture. You feel at home in these settings. And I feel like there's really no other author that is comparable to Miyazaki's sort of immersive sort of setting. Because when I read the very first book, I was just immediately within the world. I was absolutely charmed by how colorful and vivid and lush and how charming everything felt. And I don't think that there's really any other book that made me feel that way. That has a lot to do with Katherine Arden's prose. The way that she details little mannerisms, the way that she details the world building, like when she describes a bathtub or when she describes this quaint little cottage. You feel the grime, the charming sort of knickknacks all around the house. So often when people mention world building in other series, they talk about, like the magic system or the big plot points. But with Katherine Arden, it's not really much about the macro, it's more about the micro, which is again very Miyazaki-esque. You don't really care what the plot is going because you're so charmed by like the little things. You just want to bathe in these settings. On top of that, the characters are fantastic. I love Vasya so much. She is one of my favorite YA protagonists like in years. I think the last time that I was so charmed and like so pulled by a character was Inej from Six of Crows, and that was 4 years ago. I read Six of Crows in 2016, and Vasya is just so free-spirited, rebellious, and yet still kind to people. Nowadays, my issue with YA books is that when female characters are portrayed as strong, it's more about their physical aspects and the way that they are kind of aggressive with people. And I like that the author didn't portray Vasya as an unrealistic sort of feminist, because this is historical fiction Russia. This is like way back in the day. And I don't like it when modern sort of ideologies are like instilled within characters from the past, because it's not very realistic. Whereas Vasya, she has very strong feminist ideals, and yet it's done in a very subtle and realistic way. She is very frustrated by the restrictions placed upon her by the society, and yet she doesn't have the modern sort of tools to break out of this situation. She still is confined within these restrictions of the society, and she is trying to make do with everything that she has. And I thought that was a really realistic way of portraying her dilemma, because for her to just say, I'm not going to listen to what society is going to tell me to do, it's not very realistic. Yet the way that she approaches her dilemma is very, very realistic, and I really appreciated that. Another thing that I absolutely adore about this trilogy is the fact that family sort of dynamics are really the center. Again, this trilogy is very much about Vasya and her trying to be this free spirit within a very confined sort of society. And so many of the family dynamics in this book and the sort of conflicts between them occur as a result of them loving her very much and wanting the best for her and being concerned for her. But then at the same time, they're also the ones putting the burden on her to conform to society. You can't hate any of these characters because all these characters are extremely compassionate in their own way. It's just this tug of war that is so incredibly heart-wrenching. The second thing that I love about this trilogy is the fact that it has one of the best villains ever. If you watch Disney's version of Hunchback of Notre Dame, Frollo, he is one of the best villains, I think, for Disney. In this book, there's a version of Frollo, a religious fanatic, who makes Vasya's life hell. If you imagine Frollo's relationship with Esmeralda in, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, if you sum that up and then just like basically plonk that into this trilogy, that's basically Vasya's relationship with the villain. And it's just so like frustrating because you see the restrictions put on her as a woman and the fact that she can't speak out against certain injustices. I just hated this villain with all my guts. And yet even him, I thought that even this character was incredibly ambiguous. He's very arrogant, he's very ambitious, he's very hypocritical, and yet at the same time, there's this passion and earnestness within this character to do the will of God. And you see that conflicting with his own personal sort of ambitions. It just kind of breaks him down mentally, emotionally, psychologically. You kind of feel bad for him at the same time, which is crazy to say because I just absolutely hated his guts. In that respect, I don't think that there's been any other villain in a YA series that I loved or like hated this much. Think of Umbridge from Harry Potter and you think of her as, oh, she's a hypocritical bitch, but you don't feel bad for her necessarily. Whereas this villain, you feel bad for him because you get his perspective, you get his feelings and his just this consternation within this guy. And you're like, you are such a hypocrite, and yet at the same time I can't help but feel bad for you because you are so confused about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. He's so misguided in his ways, and the things that he does is so like, don't you have any shame? Like, I'm just like, oh. So yeah, this villain is incredible. He is literally one of the most intriguing and realistic religious fanatic villains that I've ever seen. I don't know, I absolutely love that. So yeah, we have a villain that's very much like Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is my favorite Disney movie of all time. On top of that, we have a very free-spirited, rebellious, empathetic protagonist, and we have really compelling family dynamics that just kind of I almost cried at certain points. On top of that, the world building in the prose is so atmospheric and immersive. I've never read another series that feels so Miyazaki-esque. That's a big deal for me to say. Now let me talk about some of the little nitpicks that I have. Number one, Katherine Arden again has very immersive prose, but I would say that her plots tend to lack a little bit of like, the pacing is not perfect. For example, the very first book, I had a few issues with how quickly the ending moved about, because for the first part of that book, it was just so immersive and I love the pacing, but then that final part, it's just like when the plot picked up and the action picked up, that's when the pacing just started to accelerate, and I didn't love that. Some people say that, her pacing is too slow. Personally, I don't see it. I personally love the immersive style of her writing. It's not an exposition dump. She's just adding little bits of color and charm that really just kind of immerses you in these Russian folklore settings. And I personally love that sort of breathing room. But I understand some people don't like that slow pacing. I think that her pacing can be a little bit conflicting for some people, so that might be a heads up for you before going in. Another thing that I would give a heads up about is that the first book is very different from the second book, and the second book is rather different from the third. Second book in the trilogy is amazing. The second book is the one where I fell in love with the trilogy. First book, I was very, very charmed, but I think that the plot was a little bit lacking. So if you have a problem with the first book in the same way as me, I would still recommend going into the second book because the second book is much more well-paced. It's a lot more plot-driven while still delivering those very immersive Miyazaki elements. Let's get into the spoiler portion of my review. I will not be going into too many spoilers into this portion, so if you want to stick around, you can, but if you have not read this trilogy, I would still recommend that you go read the books before you come back. So first book in this trilogy, Bear and the Nightingale. This book I gave 4 stars. Of all the 3, I felt is the most atmospheric. It is the most Miyazaki-esque. When I first started reading this book, I was immediately reminded of Miyazaki, and I never had that experience before. Even the cover feels most Miyazaki-esque. It feels very much like Spirited Away. Another thing that I really enjoy about this book, again, are the family dynamics. I love Vasia's father in this book. He has very sexist sort of ideals that are, in today's world, it would be definitely problematic. But I think for his time period, he could very be well labeled a feminist. I'm not saying he is a feminist by any standard in our own society today, but he is very respectful of women. He very much loves Vasia's wild spiritedness, and he loves his wife. But I like that there's this little gray morality within Vasia's father, because when he takes on this new wife in their marriage bed, he doesn't realize why she's crying. I like that little detail because it's just for heaven's sake, his first wife died, and then his second wife is so much younger than him, and she's taken away from her home to come to his home. She doesn't know this man, and she's basically, having sex with him for the first time, and she's crying, not because it hurts or anything. She's just so sad about the situation, and he doesn't really try to comfort her. He doesn't really scold her or anything, but she just basically is just looks the other way, and he's just what the hell is wrong with this girl? And it kind of goes to show that he's a product of his time. For example, he's such a good father to Vasia because he absolutely loves her wild spiritedness. He loves the way that she is. And yet at the same time, he's like, well, society doesn't accept a woman who is this wild. And while he is being very, very strict on Vasya and he's just putting all this pressure on her, he's also the one who's the most sad about it, aside from Vasya herself. He's extremely sad about the fact that he has to, force Vasya to make a decision that she doesn't want it, because it's gonna basically strip away all her free spiritedness. It's gonna take away her happiness, and he is very much aware of that. And yet at the same time, he's constantly just reminding himself, this is not what society wants from her. And he's like, this is the way things ought to be. In that sense, the characters are incredibly complex. You can't fully hate them, you can't fully love them. And I love Vasya's father, but at the same time, I was just so frustrated. And yet I couldn't fully blame him for his actions because, again, he's a product of his time. I also loved Vasya's brothers in this book. I thought they were very supportive of Vasya. I like how they treat Vasya as this rascal to be tamed. And I don't know, it was very heartwarming to see this sibling dynamic because Vasya is very much younger than a lot of her brothers and siblings. In line with that, I love Vasya herself. She is so free and free-spirited. She reminded me of this nymph. She reminded me of a fairy. She just reminded me of this otherworldly spirit. She is so charming in her own way, and I like that the author doesn't describe Vasya as being beautiful or anything. All the men around her are constantly looking at Vasya. They're thinking she's so ugly. And yet as she grows up, people around her start noticing how charming she is and how attractive she is, despite the fact that she's not typically the most attractive woman. That's a way of, the author saying, oh, she's not really pretty, but she's pretty because she is confident within herself and she's embracing her own charms. And that's something that I really liked about the author's description of Vasya. By the way, the horror elements are actually legitimately terrifying at times. When Vasya's nurse comes back from the dead and is just scratching at the door. And I really like that juxtaposition of Katherine Arden painting this beautiful, colorful, summery dream. And then on the other hand, having this really cold, terrifying sort of horror wintry setting thing going on. Every single season of the story was just given its own unique sort of flavor. And of course the characters, right? Again, I talk about the villain. He is insanely hypocritical and you just want to kill this guy. At the same time, you can't help but love him. At first, when I saw this guy in this book, I was like, okay, so is he the love interest? He's being described as being so beautiful. You don't really get the sense that he's evil, but then he's just constantly growing more and more evil, and I really like how subtly this villain became the villain by the end. For example, he kind of murders Vasya's stepmother, which is, I felt bad for Vasya's stepmother because she never asked for her own powers, and the fact that she kind of dies, you feel bad for her because you just don't get the sense that she was ever this cruel at the beginning. It's just basically her paranoia and her just becoming so frightened by her own powers that basically drove her to do all these cruel things. And in a lot of ways, this book is so free and complex, just in terms of the world building. There's layers upon layers upon layers. Katherine Arden does such a great job. Her prose is beautiful. The atmosphere is great. The characters are very, very complex. I don't think that there was any other way for, this book to have gripped me this strongly. It was just the perfect beginning. But the problem is, I would say that the last 20%, again, it did rush. The ending, it really should have milked the death. There are a couple characters who die, but the main death, I'm just gonna spoil this in 3, 2, 1. Vasya's father, Katherine Arden didn't milk his death. I kind of thought that Vasya's father was a main protagonist. At the beginning, he's kind of the one who kicks off the story. So at the end, the fact that he just got basically swatted aside and he dies and we don't really mourn for him. And again, the climax just rushed plot after plot after plot points, just zoom, zoom, zoom. I'm the type of reader who, if I don't like how the emotional moments are not milked, if a death is not milked or the climax is not milked or things rush, that's when a book really just kind of misses things for me, despite the fact that everything else was perfect. 80% of this book was amazing. The last 20% just rushed, and those were the moments where basically the most important things happened. That's where all the shit goes down. And for Katherine Arden to rush that portion, it just took that rereadability aspect of this book away from me, because this book is something that I would have reread for the rest of my life. But then if you don't nail the plot aspects, then I wouldn't want to read your book again, because what's the point? If you know that the plot is not really building up too much, or if you know that the climax isn't gonna pack a punch, in the end, I'm just gonna respect your book. I'm not gonna reread your book. And therefore, I can't give it a 5 stars, because any book that I give a 5 stars, it has to be rereadable for me. And The Bear and the Nightingale was not rereadable because of the rushed finale. Therefore, I had to drop it down to 4 stars. Another little thing that I'm gonna gripe about with The Bear and the Nightingale is that I didn't like the romance. There's a scene in the middle of the book when Vasya basically helps this water demon. In exchange, they become friends, and this water demon tells Vasya, don't trust the Winter King. At that point, I was just like so intrigued, because I thought that they might have this cat and mouse sort of dynamic when they first meet, because Vasya is a strong girl. She is very smart, and I kind of wanted her to have this like cat and mouse game with the Winter King, because the Winter King, when he approached Vasya's father, he felt a little bit devious to me. He was kind of coercing Vasya's father to give up Vasya to him. In that sense, I kind of wanted him to be a little bit morally ambiguous. And therefore, when the water demon tells Vasya, don't trust the Winter King, I was like, oh, like, is that going to be the romantic sort of relationship they're going to have? Unfortunately, it wasn't. Because again, whenever Vasya is in trouble, Roscoe is there to basically like help her. He was just kind of treating her like a special snowflake. He wasn't really asking anything from Vasya in return. He wasn't really scheming. He was kind of letting Vasya's nurse off the hook several times. Vasya's father and her nurse was supposed to tell Vasya that she was supposed to be given up to the Winter King, and whenever they appeal to the Winter King, like, please let us, keep Vasya for a little longer. He's just like, okay. And ultimately, he just kind of felt like a very bland character as a result of that, because I just felt like he could have had a lot more deviousness. I don't know. He just kind of felt like a sugar daddy character to Vasya, because he was just literally giving her everything and then like coddling her. And their initial dynamic was just that from the start. And to me, it didn't really make sense. But ultimately, I really enjoyed everything else about this book. Again, 80% of this book was literal perfection in my eyes. Just the last 20%, it did feel a lot more rushed. And I didn't like the romance, because I did feel like Morozco should have had a little bit more character by making him a little bit more devious. So let's get into the second book of the Winternight Trilogy, which is Girl in the Tower. This book is fabulous. Everything that I had in terms of the gripes with the first book, like, it was all fixed in this one. For example, the romance. I was really not on board with the romance, again, with The Bear and the Nightingale. I just ranted about this, right? I didn't like how Morozco was the sugar daddy to Vasya. And personally speaking, in this book, I did kind of feel like he was still that sugar daddy character. And I kind of didn't like how he was that plot convenience to Vasya. Whenever she was in trouble, he would always basically bail her out. But the thing that made me change my mind about these two characters and their relationship and their romantic relationship is I really like how gentle their relationship is. It's a very healthy relationship in my opinion, because again, Morozco, he could have had more personality and a little bit more charm if he was a little bit more devious. But then again, it's really rare to see very healthy relationships in YA. So I really like how he's very giving to Vasya, and Vasya, she's kind of reluctant to say I love you back to him. But Morozco makes that sacrifice at the end. He basically sacrificed his existence within this world for Vasya to be safe. And he basically asked Vasya, please don't forget me. It is the most wholesome thing and the most romantic thing that this guy could have said to Vasya. The fact that he's not really asking much back from her. He's just saying, I love you. You don't really need to love me back. You don't really need to give me anything. I just hope that you won't forget me once I'm gone. That line legitimately made me cry. Like, I was so taken aback, because again, I was not on board with this romance. But then just the very gentle, romantic, dreamy nature of their dynamic, and then also just this respect this guy has for her. There's literally nothing else for me to say. Just, I love the romance between them. This is the book that just nailed the romance for me, and it just really won me over. And again, I absolutely love the family dynamics in this book. I like that it shifts from the first book, because the first book is very much about Vasya and her father, whereas this book is a lot more about Vasya and her siblings. And it's just so heart-wrenching. They're bringing each other the most pain because they love each other so much. And it's just a perfect embodiment of what family is like, because ultimately, even in real life, family, you know, despite loving each other the most and whatnot, they're also the one who hurts each other the most. And in this book, I was just like, this is so amazing. Like, you don't really see these sort of family dynamics in YA books. That point when Vasya is reunited with her sister and her brother, and they're basically like, you know, looking at her in dismay because they don't want Vasya to go down a certain path, and yet Vasya can't help but be who she is. She's feeling sorry as well. She's not one of those characters who's like so pig-headed that she can't feel sorry or she can't feel like vulnerable. She's not one of those characters. She's just like very willing to listen to people. She's willing to take on their advice and whatnot. In this situation, again, she's kind of being guilt-tripped by her siblings, but at the same time, you can't really hate her siblings either because you see what their good intentions are for her. It's not about their own reputation. They just literally are very concerned for their sibling. And I don't know, just the love they had for each other. This book is so good in terms of those relationships. So yeah, there's really nothing for me to dislike about this book. Everything is just so almost perfect. Family dynamics, the romance actually won me over like hardcore. The prose and world building again are very beautiful. I will say that in terms of nitpicks, I think that similarly with the first book, the climax escalated and de-escalated a little bit too quickly. In this book, it wasn't as bad, but when the climax started to happen, I did feel like the plot started to move along very, very quickly. And I think that's ultimately, you know, it's not enough to hinder my love for this book, but at the same time, it is something to note. I also didn't like how that the villain, his personality change at a certain point, it felt very abrupt. Considering that so many of the other characters have this like complexity to them, you kind of love and hate every single character at the same time. I did feel like with this villain, he's just a mustache twirling villain by the end. And that was kind of weird for me because at the beginning, his character had a little bit of nuance, but then at a certain point when we realize that he's a villain, he just like goes full on mustache twirling villain. It was okay. Not every single villain has to be, you know, ambiguous, or not every single villain has to be complex, but at the same time, it is something that I would have liked personally. But ultimately, the prose is stunning. I don't think that the prose was as good as in the first book, but that's kind of to be expected because Vasya isn't immersed in nature as much. She's much more in like a city setting in the second book, so that's understandable. The magical lore and world building is amazing. Like that didn't get any worse. Oh, I love the political intrigue. The political sort of machinations that just like cascade in this book. I was really interested in that. I thought I liked that. Again, this trilogy offers so many good elements of like religious, political, societal, feminist sort of things. Everything. Like Katherine Arden doesn't miss the details, and I really enjoy that. Oh, and obviously I still like the previous villain from the first book, the Frollo character. He was still so amazing. He's so pathetic. And yet he's so pitiable. Like, pitiable? Is that the word for it? Pitiful? I was torn between wanting him to basically die and yet still be redeemed, because I'm just like, you know, you're such a scumbag and yet I just want you to be redeemed. You feel him putting all his effort into improving himself, and yet he's just totally going about it the wrong way. And he's just being this hypocrite about it, and you just want to like kill him. I don't know. He's just still such an amazing character. So love that. Oh, okay, and the romance again. I think that the thing that ultimately pulled me into this book was the romance, because I think that the first book, part of why I didn't like it a lot is because of the romance. I again felt that their relationship was very like a sugar daddy sort of relationship, whereas in this book I felt that Morosco felt a lot more like, it's just very romantic and gentle and like very feels driven. And of course the sort of sacrifice at the end where, you know, Morosco tells Vasya, I love you and you don't need to give me anything, but I love you, and just don't forget to remember me every once in a while when the snow falls. It's just literally the most romantic scene I have ever read in a book. So yeah, that's why I loved Girl in the Tower. So lastly, my final review is The Winter of the Witch. I was disappointed with this book a little bit. It's really difficult for me to say that because at the same time I had a blast. Like, you know, in the previous two books, Baron the Nightingale and The Girl in the Tower, again, I talk about how the endings rush, because when the plot driven elements are introduced, that's when Katherine Arden tend to rush her pacing. And the third book, she had a lot of ground to cover. That's why I think that she just rushed everything. It just felt like 2 books cramped into one. The beginning of this book is so gripping. It's just incredibly visceral, and you're just like watching in horror as certain events go down and seeing what Vasya has to go through, and I was just horrified. And I was like, okay, this is a really great start. But in retrospect, after reading the entire book, I felt that this beginning chunk of Winter the Witch, it should have been appended to The Girl in the Tower. The ending of Girl in the Tower felt a little bit abrupt for me, and therefore I just kind of wanted the beginning of this to be added to the end of Girl in the Tower, because I felt that that would have been a really good ending. Not only that, I felt that this beginning felt the most dissonant from the rest of the book. It would have been a better way to start with Vasya, you know, after this horrific incident, waking up from this horrific incident and just like kind of like remembering where she is and remember what happened in the previous book. And I felt that it would have been a much more cleaner way of kicking off this book, because now it's her final phase. But she goes through this like up and down all throughout this book, and it felt a lot more jarring. But again, there's so much ground that Katherine Arden wants to cover in this book, and that ultimately made this 3rd book feel very bumpy and not as streamlined. Not only that, I didn't like the death at the end of this book. Again, it was not milked, and it totally should have been. Personally, I felt that this person should not have died. I didn't think that this character should have died. I personally felt that Vasya should have died. Like, I don't know. Okay, so okay, I'm gonna cover this at the end of my review. So another thing that I didn't like about this book is, for the very first time in this trilogy, I felt that the prose and the world building suffered, because Katherine Arden was in such a rush to cover so many plot points that she just kind of is like still writing in an atmospheric way, but then she's not really adding in the charming details that she had from The Barbarian and the Nightingale. And as a result, I'm starting to get a little bit lost in this world. For the very first time, I was actually a little bit disoriented, particularly in the midnight section. It had the potential to be very, very enchanting and mysterious, but for me, I was just very like confused. There were so many moments where, you know, Vasya just like goes in and out of the midnight, and I'm like, how does this magic system work? It didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And again, I'm totally okay with not having a very hardcore magic system, but Katherine Arden always made up for that by, you know, detailing the world building, detailing the sort of atmospheric world building, and really just pointing out the charming little details. In this book, she just kind of breezes past a lot of those things, and therefore the lack of a strong, hardcore, solidified magic system, it did make the world building very confusing for me. Another thing is, I really wanted an epilogue at the end of this book, because again, I felt that this book was not as streamlined as the first 2 books. Things rushed, things felt crammed in. A lot of shit goes down in the climax. As a result, I kind of felt like, okay, like I'm feeling a little bit disoriented, I'm feeling a little bit rushed. At least maybe an epilogue could just kind of calm me down. More ideally, I felt that this book should have led into a 4th book. I felt that this book was so rushed that it could have just been stretched out into a 4th book. Because in the second half of this book, there's a very political sort of battle that goes on. And another thing that I didn't like about this book is how the main villain dies in the middle of this book. And I didn't like that, because it just kind of cut off all the momentum. It was the most impactful moment of this book for me. So I kind of wanted that to be the ending rather than the political battle. So if you were going to add this like political battle onto the end, I felt that should have been just like cut out and then put into a 4th book. Not to mention, again, because things are so rushed in the second half of this book, I felt that the death at the end of this book was not very milked. I felt that this character death could have a little bit more emotional weight. And Katherine Arden, she doesn't do a really good job of delivering the weight of character death. Again, the villain death was amazing. I thought that was actually really done really well, but the character death at the end of this book, I was just like, like you could have done so much more with that. You could have just really milked it. But again, because Katherine Arden rushed, I was not like feeling the immersive sort of weight of this tragedy. I talk about, you know, how Deathly Hallows is my least favorite book in the Harry Potter series, and that's again because, you know, certain deaths are not milked and you don't see the after effects. You don't see how people grieve. In this book, you don't see this character death being mourned as much by certain other key characters, and that was just like I hated that. But ultimately, the thing that really disappointed me was, again, at the end of The Girl in the Tower, you see this love interest basically died. But that really excited me because that finally presented an opportunity for Vasya to become her own sort of strength. This love interest, again, is kind of like a sugar daddy. He's always like a plot convenience. He's a white knight who rides in at the last minute to save her. And therefore, when he died, I was like, okay, yes, the third book is finally going to see Vasya becoming empowered, Vasya becoming her own woman and not being bailed out by certain characters. That's why at the start of this book, when the horrific incident happened, I was like, okay, this is finally the start of Vasya's struggles, her finally learning how to overcome her struggles by herself. But the problem with this book is that we bring back the love interest again very soon. And I'm like, why did you bring him back already? I understand that fans would have wanted to see more of this love interest, but at the same time, like, I don't know, I just kind of wanted to see Vasya missing her love interest more all throughout this book. And then her finally being like, okay, screw this. I need to stop mourning for this guy. I need to just kind of learn to be my own person. And then at the end, as a reward for all her struggles, I wanted this love interest to come back at the very, very end and Vasya to be reunited with him. I don't know. He just comes back very early on and it felt very done cheesily. You know, I didn't understand how he came back, to be honest with you. I don't know. I didn't like that. There are still things that I really enjoy about this book. I still really enjoy the family dynamics. I still love the characters themselves so much that regardless of the shit that goes down, I still will enjoy the book because I still love the characters so much. So yeah, I still felt for Vasya. I still felt for all of her siblings. And I loved all of the characters. I also really like the villain. Again, the villain death in the middle of the book. Wow, he went out in his own way. He still went out on his own terms. And you're just like, you still feel weirdly awed by his action. Like you feel like I still respect him. Like that was the weird thing. Like you feel like awed by him and you feel like you're like, oh, like you went out on your own terms. You did a lot of horrible shit and yet you still went out on your own terms and you're just like respecting him. You hate his guts again. Like, and yet at the same time you can't help but feel like so incredibly moved by his arc. I don't know. I also really liked his relationship with the bear. Again, if you haven't read this trilogy, like, why are you here? But the bear is just like, the bear's weird fascination with this villain. And he's just like, you have very beautiful fingers, or you're very good at like art. And he's just like very fascinated by this villain. And what started as a relationship where the bear was manipulating this villain, in the end, the villain kind of becomes his own equal. And he just like, the bear gains a respect for this guy. Their relationship actually was really touching to me. Not to mention, I also really like how the bear makes up with his brother, the frost demon. It was a good message right there. I like how, you know, family can fight all the time. Again, another element of family. Family can fight all the time, but misunderstanding can still be worked out if you have the mind for it. And I really like that. So yeah, ultimately, I still enjoy this book. There were elements of this book that I really enjoy. I really still enjoy the villain and his relationship with the bear. I also really liked Vasya's struggles at the start of this book. They were so visceral. The prose is still beautiful, but I will say that the prose was very much watered down compared to the first two books. I felt that the emotional highs were not as high because you're just kind of like telling the reader, okay, a character died, but you don't have time to mourn for this character. Not to mention, I didn't like the romance. I didn't like how the love interest was brought back because again, he became this plot convenience to Vasya, and ultimately what started out as a very high stakes sort of book, after the love interest is brought back, there's so many plot conveniences that bail out Vasya. And in the end, despite the fact that I actually love her as a character and thought that she had great potential to become her own woman, I did feel like she had a lot of things that helped her along the way. It didn't really feel like she became her own force by the end. That was the thing that really disappointed me about this book because I really wanted Vasya to be so alone at the start of this book, and then for her to overcome that by becoming her own force, by realizing her own strengths. But instead we get Vasya being bailed out by her love interest. We get her being bailed out by other sort of people who are fascinated by her, which makes her kind of a special snowflake. I don't know. There were a lot of things that just disappointed me about this book, and yet my enjoyment level of this book was 5 stars because I just love this character so much. So many conflicting feelings. So let me talk about what I expected this book to be. Okay, so this is not a review. This is me talking about what I really wanted from this book and what I expected from this book. So if you have not read this book, I'm probably going to go into like way more spoilers. So really, if you have not read this trilogy, you might really want to click out. So here's the thing. At the end of The Girl in the Tower, we have Vasya basically ending up alone because Morosko basically leaves her alone. Like, he basically dies. And I really like that because, again, for the first two books, Morosko felt like this sugar daddy and plot convenience sort of thing that, you know, always bailed her out of certain situations. And that's the thing that I kind of didn't like about his character. But the fact that he died at the end of book 2, I really thought that the author was setting Vasya up at the start of the third book to be very much alone. And then throughout the book, learn her powers, learn how to win people over into her side. Because again, she has no one else to bail her out. And then by the end, I kind of wanted Vasya to have this final climactic battle where she has finally gathered all these allies and persuaded them to be on her side. And then for her to be like the leader of this like force of otherworldly spirits like coming together and humans coming together. I just kind of wanted her to kind of be like this avatar. I kind of wanted her to be the Aang and Korra of this world where she unites all of the humans and the spirits, and her being the bridge between two worlds. And at the end of this climactic battle, I kind of wanted her to die. You know, in the first book, I talk about how she felt like this water nymph. She has this indescribable quality in the first book, and I was like, oh, maybe she's going to become like a spirit by the end of the third book. I know that sounds really stupid, but I really wanted that because, again, in the first book, I always felt like she felt like this otherworldly spirit, and by the end of the series, I kind of wanted her to kind of die, like a martyr almost. And then for people to finally be like, okay, like we need to change things. I didn't want Sasha to die at the end of this trilogy again because I felt that he and his political king, I don't know, is it the king, his friend, right? I kind of wanted them to join forces. And after Vasya dies, I kind of wanted Sasha to be like the motivator for this king to bring back the old religion, bring back the like harmony between the people and the spirits. That's why I didn't like how Sasha died at the end of book 3, because I felt that he has so many more things that he could have done. He should have become the new sort of advisor to the king. And I kind of wanted Vasya to die in his stead because, again, if Vasya in this third book had gathered all these forces and just like mobilized forces between humans and spirits and then brought them together, like the avatar, the bridge between two worlds, right? And then when she would die, it would motivate everybody to finally work together and move towards like the old religion again and just move forward into a better future. And for Vasya, I know that I don't really like it when female characters are just killed off in martyrdom, but in this case, I felt that it kind of would work for Vasya because she never felt like she belonged in this world. She never felt happy within this political system. She didn't feel comfortable within the humans. Every single one of those humans have rejected Vasya, and Vasya never felt like she belonged. She instead feels like she belongs more with the spirit. And therefore, I wanted Vasya to die and then reincarnate as a spirit so that she can live among her, you know, friends and whatnot. And then to be reunited with Morosko in death. And that's the thing that I really wanted from this book. And the fact that we didn't get that, I think that's ultimately why I didn't love this book as much. I wanted Vasya to basically die at the end of the book instead of Sasha. I wanted Sasha to become like the political motivator for this king who would mobilize Russia into this new age of harmony between the spirits and the humans. And I wanted Vasya to basically die so that she could be reincarnated as a spirit. Again, I understand it's not fair for me to, you know, judge a book for not going my way, but I don't know, I just like my idea way more. So yeah, that's my review for the Winter Night Trilogy by Katherine Arden. I love this trilogy so much. I think you can see my enthusiasm even when I'm discussing the things that I don't like about this trilogy, which goes to show that even if I have a lot of nitpicks with this trilogy, I am so in love with it. It has a lot to offer. Miyazaki has world building, really beautiful prose, amazing characters. Vasya is one of my favorite female protagonists of all time. I love the family dynamics. Literally the best thing about this trilogy are the family dynamics because they make you just like so like heartbroken. And of course the amazing villain. Best villain of all time. So thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Winter Night Trilogy below, and good night.